Welcome, my dears, to part 1 of the recap of the manhwa A Loop. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. As is often the case, the passenger got into the taxi, urging the driver to hurry. When asked where he needed to go, he named the Gwangyendong intersection, and they set off. The man finally looked up, noticing that a young woman was driving, but she immediately reassured him that she was an excellent driver. Taking a drag from his cigarette, the passenger started questioning the driver. Why would someone so young choose to work as a taxi driver when she had the whole world open to her? The girl remained composed, merely nodding along to his rambling about her future, until something in her suddenly snapped, shattering her patience. She turned up the music, rudely cutting him off, and when he asked her to lower the volume, she shot back sharply, saying she hated this. She stated outright that it utterly disgusted her, but doubting she could actually shut him up, she figured she might as well listen to the music instead of his words. The man was taken aback, staring at her with wide eyes, but she kept going, defending herself, reminding him that the seat he was sitting in wasn't a throne. In fact, it was no different from hers, so he had no reason to act high and mighty. Before he could get a word in, she pointed out something she'd noticed: how plain-looking people from the streets, the moment they settled into the back seat of a taxi, suddenly straightened up and started speaking louder than usual. Smirking, she wished him good health after his little warm-up. Now, a question lingered in her mind. Why do people like him go out of their way to humiliate others? After all, they were always risking cutting their pathetic, meaningless lives short. To emphasize her words, she shifted gears, pressing harder on the gas. The man started yelling at her, demanding to know how she dared to speak to a paying customer that way, threatening to take her to court. But the girl immediately pointed out the cigarette he was smoking in a place where it wasn't allowed. How was she supposed to block out both the smell and the smoke? Unlike him, she didn't have a stuffed nose. She could smell that stench perfectly well. Once again, she reminded him that she was a person too, that she needed to breathe. That set him off. He snapped at her to shut up. The car swerved sharply and screeched to a stop at his destination, the sudden jolt making him slide down in his seat. As if nothing had happened, the girl turned to him, held out her hand, and calmly stated the fare, $7. Once she was alone in the car, she rested her forehead against the steering wheel, blaming herself for letting that side of her slip out again. Adjusting the mirror, she glanced at her reflection and noticed the tension lines between her brows. Just as she started smoothing them out, a man's voice came from outside, making her pause and shift her gaze. She turned in the direction the familiar voice had gone, and she wasn't mistaken. It was Park Yunsu, walking arm in arm with a light-haired girl. The sight took her by surprise, and for a moment, she just watched them disappear into the distance. Then, shaking it off, she gripped the wheel and drove away. The next morning, she was already at church, paying little attention to the clergy as they listed possible sins, hatred, impatience, urging the congregation to pray together. Once again, she furrowed her brows, justifying herself. She hadn't lacked humility last night by choice. After all, the passenger had provoked her with his words. When they beat God with rods, didn't he feel pain? And if there had been not just one or two such people, then perhaps she should pray, not only for herself, but for all of them. As she rose from her seat, her mother called her name. Chae-a turned toward her, hardly surprised to see that she was here too. Her mother, concerned, asked what had happened. She had looked troubled during the prayer. She simply replied that she had seen many sick people and wished them a swift recovery. Her mother smiled warmly, saying she was proud of her, but soon got distracted by a nearby conversation. With a quick wave to her daughter, she excused herself and headed toward the group. Chae-a folded her arms across her chest, raising an eyebrow as her gaze landed on the young man she had run into the night before, now surrounded by women, humble, sincere, well-rounded, in other words, perfect, in everyone's eyes. Suddenly, one of the women mentioned that she'd love to introduce him to a nice girl, if only she knew someone suitable. Another woman laughed and waved dismissively, saying that Yunsu always claimed he wasn't interested in women, despite being quite the eligible bachelor. Listening from nearby, Chae-a raised an eyebrow and repeated the statement, unable to hold back a chuckle, drawing the group's attention. She casually admitted that she had seen him with his girlfriend last night, and joked that, of course, she could have been mistaken. Maybe it was his sister instead. The color drained from Yunsu's face. He froze, stunned, unable to answer the flood of questions from the women around him. With a small wave, Chae-a left him to deal with the situation on his own, and walked out of the church. Chae-a's taxi was parked at the entrance of the church when, suddenly, a hand slapped against her side window. Startled, she turned to see Park Yunsu standing there. He had unintentionally spooked her but simply asked if the taxi was available. When she said yes, he requested that she open the trunk. As he loaded his suitcase into the car, she was still processing the situation. They had never even spoken before, only exchanged polite nods in passing. And now, here she was, driving him to Sangdong. He hadn't had to take her taxi specifically, yet there he was, sitting in the back seat, still looking just as stunned as before, his gaze locked on her through the rearview mirror. Chae-a quickly dropped her eyes, avoiding his stare. As the car sped down the road, Park Yunsu suddenly asked where she had seen him. Chae-a shrugged. "I was working nearby," she said casually, glancing in the mirror at him. He was deep in thought, his expression unusually serious. That unsettled her. She quickly apologized, saying she hadn't meant to make him uncomfortable. "I was just joking," she explained, "but maybe I went too far." With a light laugh, she added, "Guess I'm a little crazy," before apologizing again. To make up for it, she even offered to say next time that she'd been mistaken, but he cut her off. "Do you remember anything else?" he asked. She turned toward him, repeating his question as if she hadn't heard, when, in reality, she had heard perfectly. Yunsu smiled, calm, innocent, but there was an unmistakable curiosity in his voice as he asked, "Do you remember what that girl looked like?" For a question so harmless, it sent a cold sweat down her back. Her eyes flicked from the road to him and back again, but in the end, she simply said, "Not really." The rest of the ride was silent. Park Yunsu watched her thoughtfully, and even without looking in the mirror, she could feel his gaze. The brakes squealed as the car came to a stop. Finally, they had arrived at their destination. The passenger sat still for a few seconds, and only when Chae-a repeated that they had arrived did he thank her for the ride, putting on his coat, and complimented her on her driving. As he exited the car, marveling that she hadn't suffocated during the drive, suddenly he turned back to look at her, startling Chae-a. Without thinking, she pressed the gas and sped off, leaving Yunsu, who was still watching her, standing alone. When Chae-a parked the car and opened the trunk, she let out a heavy sigh. The vindictive suitcase of her recent passenger had been left behind, and she definitely didn't want to see him just to return it. She was about to figure out how to handle the situation when suddenly, an unfamiliar number flashed on her phone. The moment she answered and greeted the caller, she recognized his voice. It was Yunsu. Chae-a asked how he had gotten her number, then remembered the suitcase, offering to bring it over right away. But then, unexpectedly, he told her to open the suitcase. Confused, she asked if she was supposed to open it, and he clarified, asking if she hadn't already. She replied that there was no reason for her to go through someone else's things, but he insisted she open it, saying she'd like what was inside. The girl couldn't help but think it was a strange way to give her a gift. As she unzipped the suitcase and began to open it, she asked if she could take whatever she wanted, but as soon as she saw what was inside, her face drained of color. She froze, dropping the phone, which continued to speak, advising her that if she didn't like the sight of the bound body of his former partner, she could always bury it. Han Chang-a, the accused, sat on the defendant's bench, listening to the verdict for her involuntary crime. The judge declared her sentence of imprisonment, and, in shock, she struggled to comprehend the length of her sentence, 5 years. She leaped to her feet, intending to protest, but the judge raised his gavel and declared that this was the final decision, slamming it down with a sharp thunk. Chang-a slammed the suitcase shut, hiding its horrific contents and pushing away the disturbing thoughts that rushed into her mind. She continued to stare at the luggage, but then lowered her gaze. The phone she had dropped still hadn't ended the call. She brought it to her ear and with a growl muttered, "Who the hell is this bastard?" On the other end, his voice, smiling as always, suggested that she had seen everything, which was why she was so shocked. He briefly advised her to take a deep breath, but Chang-a, grinding her teeth, began threatening that his end was near. She just had to show the footage from her dash cam, where he had been caught. She called him a filthy bastard, still staring at the suitcase, and wondered how such a crazy asshole could come up with something like this. But his reaction was entirely unexpected, a loud, resonating laugh that seemed to echo in her head. He was waiting for their next encounter and showed no emotional reaction to the camera. It only confirmed that there was no way out now. She had to do it. She had to go and tell everything. Of course, if she didn't mind risking looking like a liar in the eyes of others, a former criminal just trying to shift the blame. His malicious laughter grew louder, filling her ears, and when Chang-a heard footsteps behind her, she quickly slammed the trunk shut, as if the body were still exposed. She turned her head to look at a woman carrying a shopping bag, who was curiously eyeing the driver by her car. Chang-a watched her until she turned her head and disappeared around the corner. Walking away and allowing Chang-a to finally breathe, leaning back against the trunk. Park Yunsu's laughter still echoed through the phone, grabbing her attention once again. Summoning a mask of confidence, she asked how sure he was that this situation would stop her from turning him in. Taking a deep breath away from the phone's microphone, she quietly and seriously, with a hint of threat, spoke, saying that she would leave the trunk open and go home, and that he should come and take the damn suitcase. Her hands clenched in nervous anticipation, praying he would agree, but he told her he wasn't going to do that, and hung up, leaving her furious. She slammed her fist against the car. She got into the vehicle, trying to calm herself, and reached for the dashcam with the evidence. After all, she had only had one client today. Chae-a stared at the camera, already hearing the dialogue. Well, more accurately, the monologue. Her eyes widened in shock as she watched herself speaking on the recording, with no one else in the car, except for her. It was already dark outside, and the girl sat in the car, staring at the forest ahead. Chae-a was prepared. Spare clothes, gloves, and a shovel lay on the back seat, something she still couldn't quite believe. She glanced at herself in the mirror and then looked back at the dash cam, visualizing the situation like a rat cornered by a cat, biting back. That bite turned out to be the fact that he wasn't on the recording. How could it be possible that he wasn't on the camera? The girl closed her eyes, resting her head against the steering wheel from the headache and the swirl of thoughts in her mind, but quickly opened them, pulled her hood over her head, and gathered her thoughts. First, she had to do everything to protect herself and not give up, and only then think things through. Finally, having dug the hole, Chae-a approached the car and opened the trunk, struggling to lift the cursed suitcase, and rolled it toward the excavation site, breathing heavily. Stopping right at the target, she froze for a moment. The sweat dripping down her face began to mix with the sudden tears that appeared, but Chae-a slapped her face, trying to stop the flow of emotions and thoughts, convincing herself not to think about it right now. With every swing of the shovel and the burial of the poor girl's body in the suitcase, she apologized fervently. It was incredibly hard, and she had to hurry before she completely lost her mind. After a while, the ground was flat again. Everything was finally finished. At least, that's what Chae-a thought, until the sound of a camera shutter made her freeze. Then another, and another, until the girl turned around. Park Yunsu was standing there taking pictures of her with his phone, catching her in the act of burying the body. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the shovel tighter, demanding to know what kind of animal was standing right in front of her. The guy smirked, showing no sign of his true emotions, and turned the screen toward her, revealing the photos where he had caught her red-handed. Chae-a's heart pounded wildly as undeniable proof of how she was burying the corpse appeared right in front of her face. The guy mocked her with exaggerated pity, feigning surprise at such circumstances. After all, how could such a fragile, angelic girl, who he had seen at church, be so oblivious to everyone around her, burying a body covered in mud? Before he could say another word, something unexpected happened. The criminal forcefully kicked the smartphone out of the blackmailer's hands. She immediately rushed toward the phone, intent on taking it, but didn't see Yunsu's sly trip. A second later, she was flying toward the ground, sprawling out on it, but luckily for her, the target was close. She just needed to find the strength to reach it before the approaching guy could beat her to it. She managed to grab it, but then she saw the legs of her pursuer, followed by the sound of his voice, full of surprise. Not everyone could summon the energy for such attempts. She wanted to spring up, run off with the evidence, do anything, but she remained on the ground. Her thoughts raced, searching for an answer. She couldn't understand what had frozen her, leaving her unable to move. All she could do was listen to the guy. He was explaining how, in a courteous conversation, people often reveal everything. It always made her suspicious. Behind the face, the mask, there was always some secret hidden from others' eyes. He squatted down in front of her, asking what Chae-a thought, but quickly interrupted her, taking the phone. Who, if not her, would know about this? He reached for her neck, making her pale even further, but instead, he grabbed her chin, lifting it up, forcing the poor girl to look at him. In a quiet, gentle, and sympathetic tone, the threat came, carrying more fear than the entire situation. After all, she wouldn't want to go back to prison, would she? Her life would be wasted, and worst of all, it would be because of a crime she hadn't even fully committed. Like a devil, he proposed a strange deal. One person once a week would have to be at a specific place because of her. With these words, he handed her a neatly folded piece of paper, which she only glanced at briefly. She lifted her eyes to him, but before Chae-a could ask any questions, Park Yunsu pointed at her, signaling that she had to respond. And when he started pointing upward, the girl's head followed. With tear-filled eyes, she stared at the ominous figure before her. the one who was studying her with an eerie gaze, one that suddenly shifted, as if from a nightmare. In a cold sweat, Chae-a jumped up, breathing heavily, and lowered her head, returning to reality. 6 days had passed since that fateful night, and according to the deal she had been forced to accept, today was the last day she had to fulfill her part, and she hadn't dared to do it earlier, nor had she told anyone. What was she supposed to do now? The night had already fallen over the city. Chae-a sat in her car, having made up her mind to leave the house. Her eyes kept darting to the display. There was little time left for any attempt to lure someone. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they crossed paths at the church, and she didn't follow through with the order. But his voice, with the blackmailing question about her desire to return to prison, made her head ache, and she squinted. Should she really obey his orders? After all, compared to ending up in a cell, his tasks weren't that difficult. They were quite doable, but just the thought of yielding made Chae-a snap back to reality, falling once more into a sea of doubt. Sighing from the wave of contradictions that had overtaken her, she leaned back in the seat, then looked out the window. She was tortured by the unfairness of the situation she had found herself in, but all her attention suddenly shifted to the drunken man who got into her car and told her to drive him. Chae-a tried to politely explain that she wasn't currently on duty, but the incoherent passenger, with indignation and curses, lashed out, scolding her, claiming it was her job. She had no right to throw a client out. Suddenly, he lay back in the seats behind her, waving his hand and saying to take him to Incheon, which abruptly stopped the driver's objections. She sighed in surprise and asked him again where he needed to go. The address the man gave a second time matched the place Yunsu had specified. It felt like her heart skipped a beat, but she turned back to the wheel, accepting the order. The car drove down the deserted street, as empty as Chae-a's mind. She glanced at her sweetly sleeping passenger and hesitantly asked again if he was sure he wanted to go to Incheon. There was no answer, aside from quiet snoring, and the girl thought about what a coincidence this was. It seemed like a wonderful stroke of luck. She hadn't followed the blackmailer's orders. She was just taking a passenger to the location he had mentioned. Now she wondered if he knew every move she made, but that couldn't be discovered without interacting with him. Every few minutes, she repeated to herself that she was just driving a client, trying to calm the oppressive thoughts. The car stopped in front of a dark, residential area, and the girl, in an attempt to wake the passenger, called out a few times, informing him of their arrival, and turned around. But behind her, there was nothing. No sign of the drunken man, neither in the car nor on the street. Back at her apartment, the question about whether the man really wanted to go to Incheon kept repeating in her mind. She sat at the table, nervously shaking her legs, and abruptly paused the footage from the dashcam, staring in disbelief at the laptop screen. Rewinding the footage a few seconds back and resuming playback, she fixated on the moment when she had tried to wake him up. He disappeared as suddenly as he had in the car, leaving the empty seats behind. Unable to believe her eyes once again, she clicked the mouse repeatedly, rewatching the footage and wondering if she was losing her mind. The sunlight streamed through the windows onto the girl, who had her head resting on her arms on the table. She hadn't been able to close her eyes and was contemplating whether she should go to the church today. Her hands trembled as soon as she recalled that night, especially his scrutinizing, strange, and unsettling gaze. She found the strength to stand up, resisting the panic, and filled herself with the resolve to figure out everything, whatever it was. The closer she got to the church, the harder it was for her to grasp everything and take a deep breath. Chae-a stopped right in front of the building, examining it as if she were seeing it for the first time. He was probably already inside, and that made her nervous. As she hesitantly reached for the door and grabbed the handle, the scene when Yunsu had taken the phone from her hand immediately resurfaced in her mind. Like she'd been burned, she instantly pulled away, wondering why she had even come here. She turned to leave, but came face to face with the last person she wanted to see. Before her stood Park Yunsu, holding a boy by the hand. He didn't even look at her, and Chae-a looked at the child, who respectfully nodded at her, greeting her. The boy opened the creaky door and stepped inside, not looking back at her until the very last moment. Chae-a's eyes widened as that strange look, the one that haunted her nightmares, turned back toward her through the small gap of the closing door. Now there was almost nothing left to fear. Clenching her fist, she stepped into the church, which now felt foreign to her. A woman was speaking with the boy Yunsu had brought, asking about his health, referring to a recent illness and advising both of them to dress warmly before bed. The girl sat in her usual spot, watching the caring woman and the mysterious boy, who called the man who brought him uncle, Chae-a had gone to this church every week, and to her memory, she had never seen Yunsu with a child. From the conversation, she managed to catch that his name was Ji-hai, and now all she could think about was, he didn't know anything about what had happened, right? Soon the mass began, and people started getting in line and rising from their seats. The girl, however, couldn't focus. She kept wondering, why would a scoundrel like Park Yunsu need a child? She hoped that the boy was just trailing behind his uncle. Suddenly, he asked Chae-a if Ji-hai could stand next to her, and she nodded, allowing him to join, unable to take her eyes off him for a few seconds. The mass started, but doubts filled her mind. Her gaze fell on his mess, which caught her attention, followed by his slightly strange smile. And then Ji-hai turned to her and called her sister, breaking all of Chae-a's hopes of his innocence. He handed her the familiar folded piece of paper with a new mysterious address and made a strange request, asking her to take care of him again.